I want to welcome you to this AP Giannini conversation. I want to thank our board of directors and our advisory panel for their support, and for Gilead Sciences for their financial support. Our guest for this AP Giannini Fellows conversation is Karen Eisenhauer, 1992 Fellow of the AP Giannini. Karen, how did you get from wherever you were to the AP Giannini Foundation those years ago?
Thanks. It's great to be here. I appreciate this opportunity to meet everyone and to share some insights and discuss science communication. Back then, I had done a PhD at UC Davis, and my research was on equine reproduction. I was a horse person even back then. So I started looking around for postdocs position. I ended up selecting a postdoc at Stanford University at the Medical Center with Aaron Shui in the Department of OBGYN. And while I was still at Davis and had started corresponding with Aaron about the type of work I would be doing and the projects I would work on, he suggested that I apply for a Giannini Foundation fellowship. So I worked on it with him from Davis, and yeah, we did it that way. And then I went down to the interview, which, if I remember correctly, was in Pebble Beach, or is that correct? Yeah. And one thing that was interesting is, on the communication note, it was through my writing that fellowship that I started to realize maybe I have some skills in science communication, because I remember that Aaron, my PI, was really happy with the quality of the first draft fellowship application that I prepared. And, I didn't think anything of that, but I still remember that. Like, when he got it, he said, "Oh, this is a really good draft. And, oh, you know how to write. You can write about science." And that was the first time I kind of realized, like, oh, maybe I can do this.
But you didn't go directly into science and medical writing, correct?
Correct. So when I did my postdoc at Stanford, I was still thinking I wanted to go into academia. I was targeting working at a liberal arts college, I went to liberal arts for undergrad. So I was very interested in that kind of setting. But when I was doing my postdoc at Stanford, I started finding myself less interested in staying in the research and increasingly drawn to working more as a generalist rather than being a specialized, and also having more of a direct connection with the healthcare industry. I mean, even though I was in the medical center, the research I was doing was pretty far removed from having an impact on people or even animals, even veterinary medicine. So I started to think about what could I do that would use my science training and my communication skills, and that could be a viable career. Yeah, so I did a postdoc there. I was there almost 3 years, and then I got a job, as a science writer after my postdoc.
It's interesting when we think about communications. Medical schools, science curricula has never really emphasized communications. And when you think about COVID, all the messaging and all the interviews that we've been inundated with the last 2 or 3 months, do you think that's a fundamental flaw that really should shift, that communication should be an integral part of science and research training?
Yeah, I do, Jaron. I think the COVID-19, I know people talk about the before and the after. I think within scientific communication too, this could be a watershed moment for us, for the scientific community and the medical community, because I think that it has really highlighted the gaps that exist in communicating, and the importance of being able to communicate to the public at large, as well as within the scientific community, because we've seen some changes already even within the scientific community in terms of how communication is happening during this pandemic.
Well, you mentioned gaps. I'm curious, when we work with the fellows in the communications training program, one of the things that I always ask is, do you ever see a PowerPoint? Do people have a lot of slides? Are the slides legible? Can you see what's on the slide? And they always say, "Oh no, there's too many slides. We can't read them often." Then I say, Why do you think that happens? So what are the gaps, and why, when scientists communicate, of course we're being general here, but when they communicate, often they forget that there's an audience out there, and the piece may go on way too long. When they have a Q&A period, they're always famous for, anybody have any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, exactly.
Why do you think that happens?
Well, number one, I think historically, even if you look at the mentors and people we're learning from, there's a lot of bad writing out there, but yet people have still been successful. So they're not as motivated to improve that, number one. Number two, I think there's just so much focus on the data and the excitement of the data that there's a lot of energy put on that, and running the experiments and getting a certain result, and that just takes so much priority and so much energy that the communication piece is almost an afterthought. And I think, yeah, it has to come from the mentors and the PIs and the faculty to kind of start changing that. But again, they're stretched very thin, and they've gotten where they are sometimes with having these gaps, so they're not as motivated. I don't know, Jerry, what are your thoughts about the gaps?
It's interesting. I'm a theater person at heart. And that's sort of my background in radio and talk radio. And I look at the heart, the spirit, the soul, even those are not scientific terms. But if you're looking at somebody in the eye, and what's behind your eye is fear or is a lack of freedom, famously, one of the greatest answers to a question that someone could ask you is, great question. I have no idea. Does anyone in the audience have something that they can reflect on? This is out of my area, but I'll tell you what, we'll make a note of that and we'll get back. In other words, there are a lot of responses. What people want more than anything is to responded to, not necessarily the answer if you don't have the answer. And I see people not really engage with an audience in a meaningful, personal way. Now,
that's a good point. Yeah. Yep, I've experienced that myself. That's a very good point. And from your theater background, you can have that unique perspective to think about that. Yeah, they're not thinking about the audience, like you said, and engaging them. It's the communication style is very one way, right? Except at the end, like you said, are there any questions? Oh, we're out of time. I don't see anyone raising their hands. We're not comfortable with that pausing or that silence and letting people have time to formulate the questions. And then I think also, just remembering back to my grad school and postdoc days, there is this fear of being exposed to something that you don't know. And that's a fear that people have. And, we have to create an environment where that's okay. I mean, I think even Dr. Fauci, of course, has been a role model in how to communicate science during this pandemic. And he's been very upfront about things that he doesn't know or we don't know yet. Or when he's made a mistake, he will say that. So that's been really exciting to see him as a role model.
I was doing an interview once with a writer, and I was on stage at a theater and asked him a question. And he paused for a very long time. Now, it might have been 15 seconds. But radio, you got to keep it moving. You don't want dead air. Afterwards, I asked my daughter, what did you think of that? And she said, Dad, it was fun to watch him think. And I don't think we allow people time, whether it's on the question part. There are questions in every audience I've ever been before. But you have to give people time to think and to think through a question. So I think that gaps, when you were talking a moment ago, there are so many idiosyncrasies to communication. And I think people really need to think about it in a very, very detailed and specific way. And I think we just don't give a lot of time to that.
Yeah, and communicating about science is hard in a lot of ways. And again, this coronavirus pandemic has really highlighted some of the challenges. The main one being the uncertainty that we have. And I mean, with this coronavirus, it's been visible, the pace, the amount of uncertainties we have, and the pace at which information is changing. And, as scientists, we want to be factual, we want to be accurate, and that is challenging in this coronavirus pandemic because the data and the information is changing every day. And some things that people are saying today may very well turn out to be wrong. And that, that can create some discomfort, I think, for scientists.
And even the data part of this, the data, the more people you test, the more people you find that have had it, do have it. So we're not, I think, the kind of foundation of this for me is that there are principles involved. And sometimes it's like you can memorize the Latin name of the plant, but you forget the overall point of biological diversity, as an example.
Yeah.
Now, you've mentored and trained people who have migrated from where they wanted to go in science and research into writing. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Sure. So when I was the head of the medical writing department at Vertex Pharmaceuticals, I was the first writer they hired, and over time we grew the department. When I left earlier this year, we had almost 30 people there. And there is actually a shortage of good science communicators in industry, at least in the biotech pharma industry. So what I found is I was recruiting people. It was very, very hard to find experienced writers to fill the openings that I had in the department. I think over the 18 years I was at Vertex, I probably hired maybe 10 experienced writers and, 30 or 40 who were fresh out of grad school, out of postdocs. So one of the reasons I did that is I wanted to, quote, pay it forward, because someone had given me a chance to make a break into the field and to make that transition. And I was so happy with that I wanted to kind of pass that on and help other people who are interested and give them a chance. And the other reason, like I said, was just practical. That seemed a best way to get our pipeline going for writers. So what we did is we put in a training program in place in the department, and we hired people. Almost everyone was out of a postdoc. Some had worked in research in industry. And a lot of the skills that you learn as a PhD and a postdoc are transferable to a science communication skill, or in my sense, medical writing. So what we did when we interview people and train and bring them in is really focus on those transferable skills, the critical thinking, the ability to juggle multiple projects, the ability to work quickly, the ability to deal with pressure, and independent critical thinking skills. And we kind of capitalized on those and guided people in that direction. And then with most people, within about a year, they were quite productive in their new field of medical writing in my department.
One of the tips that I give people is when you're writing something, read it aloud. Your ear will hear something that's wrong that your eye won't see. And, the famous THERE, THEIR they're both spelled correctly, but are they used in the right context? And sometimes relying on just reading something on a page isn't sufficient. It's that sense of freedom that we're also trying to encourage our fellows to move towards. There is nothing like feeling free and confident in front of an audience. Doesn't mean that your presentation is perfect. It doesn't mean that you know everything, that you can answer every question, but that sense of exhilaration and joy and freedom. But it only comes from discipline. So it's the sustained effort at communication, something every day, once a week, whatever it takes. The frequency builds that muscle memory that leads through discipline to freedom. And most people never get there.
You're exactly right about the frequency, and that's true for the written communication as well as the oral. I mean, it is true. Like, I used to give a lot of presentations when I was in academia, and then when I got in industry, I had a gap where I didn't do them, and then I felt nervous again doing them. But anyway, so you've got to stick with it. But with the science writing too, the written skills of science, it is something you can learn and get better at over time. It's not, I mean, there are some people like me who would never be a good, fiction writer. I just don't have that creativity and that ability to do that. But almost everyone, I think, can become a good science writer. Like you said, Jerry, it's about about getting comfortable with it and practicing and repeating it. And then you're right, it's a sense of freedom. When you can put out a document for people to review or to read, and you feel comfortable with it, and you feel you can express yourself, and you're starting, as you said earlier, a dialogue with people. Because I think speaking of a dialogue, one of the misconceptions that some people have too when they think about readers and the written documents or reading online is that it's a direct path, like from your brain to the words on the page to their brain. And if you just write it a certain way, it'll go through 100%. But everyone reads with their own filter and their own background. No one is a totally blank slate. So as a writer, as a science writer, what you want to do is minimize the chance that people will misinterpret what you're writing. You can never guarantee that they're going to, understand exactly what you intended, but you want to get to the point where you minimize the chances that there's a misunderstanding or misinterpretation. And it's through that experience and practicing that you can hone your skills there and feel that freedom in doing that.
I'm smiling because I know exactly what you're talking about. And by the way, we're talking with Karen Eisenhauer, 1992 fellow of the AP Giannini. This is a series of conversations that Karen's the first, but we'll be having with Giannini Fellows. I want to thank the board of directors of the foundation and our scientific advisory panel and Gilead Sciences for their help as well. They support our colloquium, and this year was the year we weren't able to do it. I see that a number of our new 2020 fellows are on the Zoom call. And one of the things, I use this line, Karen, from Jerry Seinfeld, and he says, people fear, I think the quote is something like, people fear public speaking and death, in that order. And so if you're in a funeral, you better be in the casket than deliver the
eulogy.
But it's incredible how people fear communicating. And what I want to do is go the other way. In other words, most people want to get behind the podium, and so there's a barrier there. I want them eyeball to eyeball with the audience and to look at people in the eye. And when you look at somebody directly in the eye, and then the people around that person will pick up on that. Tell me a little bit about and I know you're not focused on public speaking, but the broad umbrella of communications is something you've done for decades. Where do you feel the most critical fundamental gaps that individuals have when they're either writing or speaking to an audience?
For scientists, you mean? What gaps do scientists have? I think the fundamental gap I think is what you alluded to earlier, Jerry, which is not thinking enough about your audience. So the fundamental gap I see in scientific writing and presentations is presenting too much complex information and not bring your audience along with you and losing your audience. And again, I think it goes back to this desire to show how much you know, show all the data you have, show how much. I mean, I see that even in the biotech industry. So there's a gap there in terms of what happens is you presenting an avalanche of information, and then the reader can't tell what's really important and can't follow. So I think that's the biggest gap I see, both in presentations and in written documents. And then I think there's also a gap too in data displays. I mean, that's getting better, but I still see, as you said earlier, you do see presentations where they can't even read the figure or the table, and the font is too small, or the axes aren't clearly labeled, etc. So again, it comes back to being able to look at your presentation with fresh eyes, with the eyes of an outsider. And if you maybe, it's very hard to do that yourself. You can develop that skill over time, but what you can do is get feedback from others right along the way. Just have a peer or a friend or your mentor take a look at something and get their reaction to it, and just get their feedback early on, because a fresh eyes and fresh perspective really can help a lot.
One of the glorious things in writing are editors,
Yes.
people who look at what you're saying and to say, that doesn't work. This can be shortened. You can use one word here, you use three. So editing is incredibly important. I will add to that self-evaluation, self-assessment is a critical skill, and I don't think we use that enough. One quick little thing, I always recommend to our fellows that the story that they're going to end up doing for our foundation is a chapter in a book. The story is a whole book, but if you break it down into chapters and you begin to say, well, okay, that's a 3-minute chapter, that's a 4-minute chapter, I can put those two together, but the other ones aren't necessary right now. What I want is not what I want to say is always important. It's really what I want my audience to remember, which is based upon editing and also self-evaluation. Let me open this up just a little bit, if that's okay with you, Karen, and
Sure.
other folks that might have questions. I'm in speaker view myself, so I'm just seeing Karen and myself. But if you have a question that you'd like to ask Karen, if you'd like to have something that you want to make sure that we mention, maybe you have a comment, maybe you have something about your own nervousness about communication, your own worry, that would be really cool. There is a question from Sam, Karen. It says that you oversaw a lot of writing output at Vertex. How did you determine what to write about? Was there a creative aspect to choosing your topics? And if so, how did you approach that?
Most of what we wrote at Vertex and in medical writing jobs is actually dictated by the development programs we're doing. So Vertex, we were developing drugs for hepatitis C and then for cystic fibrosis. So the department I worked in and led, we were supporting the clinical development programs for those drugs. So we would write clinical trial protocols, clinical trial reports, regulatory filings for FDA and European agencies. So basically what we wrote was driven by the overall program goals and timelines. And so every year we would meet with the project team. So say for Kalydeco, that's our first CF drug we got approved. And we would go over what are the milestones that that team wants to meet this year? What are the regulatory filings? What are the studies we're going to do, both in the lab and clinically? And then from there, that would drive what documents we would write. We did at Vertex, well, every biotech company also has a publication group where that's your publications are driven by your strategy, by the publication strategy, and by what scientists there want to publish. But that's kind of a separate area from the area I worked in.
Tell us a little bit more about Vertex. What does the company do? How long has it been in business? What its focus is, et cetera?
Sure. Vertex has been in business since, I think, the mid-'80s, but it didn't really take off until we developed our first drug for hepatitis C, which was called telaprevir, or Incivek. And it was the first direct antiviral for hep C to become approved in the US. Actually, we were approved at the same day, I think, as our competitor, Schering Plough, had a drug as well. But anyway, that was back in, I should know that, maybe 10, 12 years ago. Unfortunately, Gilead and other companies, I know Gilead is one of the sponsors, came out with better antiviral drugs. So our hep C drugs, the sales just tanked and we took it off the market. But at the same time, we were ramping up our research in cystic fibrosis. And that's been the area of focus of the company. We currently have 4 marketed products for cystic fibrosis. And they were really, they are still the only medicines for CF that treat the underlying cause of disease. They actually target the defective CFTR protein and thus provide systemic benefits. And it's gotten a lot of positive coverage. I mean, Obama even mentioned, Kalydeco and precision medicine in one of his speeches when he was president, because it really was a first in class, this type of approach to targeting CF. And currently now, Vertex, as I said, I left the company in February of this year, although I'm still doing a little work for them as a contractor. They're currently now expanding the pipeline into other areas of high unmet need and targeted therapies. So we have a partnership with CRISPR Therapeutics. We're developing drugs for beta thal and sickle cell using CRISPR Cas9. And we also have pipeline in pain, AAT, and other therapeutic areas. So we're branching out now from CF.
There's a question here from one of our new fellows, Liz, and she asks, I think one of the challenges, this is a question for you, Karen. I think one of the challenges with scientific communication for COVID has been accurately communicating the uncertainty and fluidity of science with the public. For example, the way that the stock market, I love this, spikes when there is news of a positive vaccine trial with 6 monkeys, but when Dr. Fauci admits the uncertainty, I feel that he is attacked by people who are looking to discredit him. What do you think are best practices for talking about scientific uncertainty?
I think, obviously to be straightforward about it, to focus on when you're communicating in particular with non-scientists, to really focus on the scientific method, because a lot of people don't understand that and don't understand the uncertainty. So I think, and that's something we can all bring to the table. This COVID-19, as I said, gives us all an opportunity to help the situation and practice our communication skills. So explaining to people about the scientific method is one way to do that. And then I think with the uncertainty, I think Dr. Fauci again and has done a great job when he was doing those daily press briefings that Trump had. They would put up the graph and show the confidence intervals and just try to explain that this is the way science works, that we are basing what we're saying on the best information that we have now, but we're going to continue to learn more, and that may change. So it's just a matter of being clear to not overstate what is the fact, today, to make sure that people have the bigger context of the situation. But it's a challenge. It's hard.
And I think it's a great thing what you just said, because what our scientists, the people that are on our call right now, whenever they're asked about something, you can generalize it at the very beginning. Science is a process. Here's the way we're looking at it. We make mistakes that they're peer reviewed. In other words, some general overview in a minute, and then go to the specific. I think we focus too much on trying to answer the question, which may be very narrow, which leads to our other question here from Nicole. She says, researchers' work and journal articles tend to be very technical, Karen. Do you have any tips for a scientist who wants to write about their work but reach a broader audience?
For developing those skills. Actually, I read about a course at Stanford that is doing that in the class. I think it's an immunology course, and what they do is, if I could just go on a little tangent here, they have a regular kind of journal club where they discuss the articles, but then the students have an assignment to write like a New York Times style science news piece about it for a general audience, which I thought was a really creative way of really integrating that skill. In terms of how to develop those skills, one thing I would try to do, an easy way, is to try to amplify what's already out there. So I know friends of mine who are scientists have done that, like on Facebook or Twitter. They'll repost something that a scientist or that CDC posted, and then they'll add some text around that to kind of try to explain it a little bit, to their audience, to their friends or their family. I don't have a lot of experience myself actually doing that, so I don't know if anyone else has any suggestions on how to make it more approachable for the general audience, the scientific literature.
It's everything we've said in this conversation, which is writing is an important fundamental skill. And if you have an editor, or test it with a friend, in other words, Broadway shows don't happen on Broadway. They happen way, way far away. And then they're tested all the time. And then they're changed. Iteration is a cool thing. Editing is a cool thing. So I think some of the fundamental principles here that we're talking about are applicable to all of our life. And even in trying to broaden our research to reach a larger audience.
Yeah, and I just thought it's one other thing, Jerry. Just it's a little bit of a tangent, but if you're having a conversation with someone too about the science, like again, I'm just thinking verbal, not written. And it's important too, going back to the audience, to understand their viewpoint and where they're coming from. So don't make assumptions about what you think people know, what they're about the disease, about COVID-19 or its science in general. So engage your audience, try to understand what their viewpoint is and what they do know. And then with that information, you can communicate to them more effectively. Just don't make assumptions and try to connect on an emotional level with people. Because I think one thing that's interesting is this COVID-19 has, again, really illustrated how politicized and partisan science can be. I mean, we have the climate change and other examples, but this is really a fast thing in real time. And so, focusing on facts and accuracy of your statements is not going to win over someone if it's an ideological or, difference of opinion. So it's important when you think about lay audiences or general audiences to, again, understand where they're coming from and understand that you're not dealing with a blank slate. What is their viewpoint? What are their concerns? What are their conceptions? And build a relationship with them, and then you can, convey some facts and information, and just try to have yourself be a resource for them. You're not going to be able to change someone's mind, in one conversation. But if you can just open their minds about the scientific method, maybe give them some facts, a little bit of information, that can maybe start over time to change their perspective.
I want to ask, one of our scientific advisory members is Victor Nazay and UC San Diego. And I know, Victor, your lab, your fellows and your researchers, et cetera, write a lot. And I'm not sure if you can turn on your camera and your microphone, but if you could talk a little bit about how you view the writing process and why it's important under the umbrella of communication skills.
Well, certainly the writing is the one common currency that will continue throughout your career, along with your ability to collaborate and innovate. And I think people would be surprised when they embark on a scientific career what percentage of your time and what percentage of your success depends on clear scientific writing. I would say that's the single most important activity I have in terms of generating measurable output from our laboratories. And I'm, well into, my career now. We have published 450 papers. So every one of those papers was probably, not accepted on its submission. So there would be 3 or 4 iterations of those, and then probably about 6 to 8 grant proposals a year, maybe 30 to 40 recommendation letters a year. And then we try to communicate our science, obviously in scientific presentations, but also in emails that you send to other people with a chance to make a first impression about a potential new collaboration or a biotechnology application of your research. So it's absolutely foremost. And I can say that improvement in writing throughout my career, and I went to a small liberal arts college and always tried to emphasize writing, but looking back at my original articles that I wrote early in my career, I'm a little bit aghast at seeing just how long it took me to get a point across and how my abstract of the paper was recapitulated at the end of the introduction and then recapitulated a third time at the beginning of the discussion, when really all those three sections have different functions. And I think when you try to publish for the very general audience journals with tight word limits, you end up, forcing yourself to have that discipline, because often those are data-rich papers. But then I think it's a good idea to write that way no matter what journal you're communicating with. So I think that's very important. And I think that I'm not sure whether, as we get quite as much practice now in writing as we did in earlier educational models. And so current scientists tend to be much more sophisticated than we were at things like the PowerPoint presentations. I mean, it's very hard to see a student give a terrible PowerPoint presentation, but very often you see senior professors do so. But with writing, I do see that almost all my trainees, including early postdocs, could really hone that craft. And that's the single most important thing they could probably do towards their success.
It's interesting that when you say, I mean, we're a verbal society. We're Twitter messages and 114 characters and all that stuff. But writing and writing something down is at the core. It's the fundamental. Ming, one of our other scientific advisory committee members, interestingly, is a reviewer for NIH grants. And what's interesting about that experience, we were talking with Karen about the value of a good editor. And I'm curious, Ming, if you wouldn't mind turning your camera and mic on and talk a little bit about what you see in the writing that you're given, because our fellows, they go into industry, they're in academia, they're in many different areas, but often they want their own lab. They have to hustle for money. They have to write grants or they have to write proposals. So what are you seeing, Ming, in the material that you're evaluating?
Many faculties have gone through NIH review processes. It's an incredibly great learning process. If you want to know how to write grant, there's nothing better than participating in a session that review other people's grants. So, of course, with grant writing, we're talking about the general framework, how you frame the question, how you articulate the novelty at the level that other reviewers can understand, and how to simplify the message. There's nothing so unique about this process. It's this sort of a same process, engaging your reviewer, involving in certain pictures and photos, not making a wall-to-wall typed letters. So it's sometimes it's not just the message, but it's also the presentation, and also stressing the key point in a very clarified fashion. Another point I want to echo what Victor just mentioned in terms of writing. The key aspect of a success is writing. There is actually a study asking the question, what is the key trait that a trainee or graduate student would be ultimately successful in academia? Is it the work experience? Is it the past GPA, or is it just some other school names? It turns out the most deciding factor is the ability to write, that also strongly reflect in the GRE verbal skills. I find that incredibly interesting, and sort of a good point to reflect. So putting time into thinking about how to write clearly and better and fast is an incredibly important skill to build.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Ming. It's interesting, the scientists that I remember reading about in the 1850s, for example, they were writers, they were poets, they were philosophers, they were artists. They had all of these skills aimed at affecting and impacting and communicating with the public. Ryan Morey, one of our fellows, 2019 fellows, wants this, has a question I think is pretty cool. And we'll kind of open this question up. Maybe others of you have a reply to it. But he says, what tips do you have for data presentation? I've noticed, especially with COVID, how poorly data is presented, especially he mentions, I think, the New York Times, for example, trying to compare deaths in places with raw numbers instead of per capita, or people publishing graphs with poorly made trend lines. Do you have any general tips for making high quality figures that are easily interpretable? So I want to open that up. Who has sort of a thought for Ryan based upon that? Victor, go ahead.
Well, I guess, a couple of things that were conveyed to me and which I tried to bring forward in my presentations is, first of all, I mean, it's quite different than the research manuscript, obviously, which is a complete document on the science you're presenting. But one of the most distracting things is if you have texts like full sentences on your slide, as it flashes up there, the reader is compelled, or the audience is compelled to read that. And at the same time, you're speaking, probably trying to convey the same points, but at a different cadence, staggered in time for where they're reading. And there's no value in that. Either their reading is disturbed or their listening to you is disturbed. That cannot be synchronous. So in general, you should try to devoid your slides of all text except for maybe, individual words or bullet phrases which organize things. It's good to have a take-home message of the slide as the title of the slide. But then, you're not going to take figure 2 out of your paper and just plant it there, because I think the most disturbing things to hear are as follows. This is a busy slide, but what I really want you to focus on is this one panel. Well, you could have done the person the favor of just taking that one panel out, and maybe your slide would only have 2 bar graphs or 1 flow cytometry graph to make your single point. I think people understand that this work has been published, that you're a successful scientist that is being asked to speak in this forum. You don't have to snow them with a lot of information. So I think that's very important. And then work very hard on your segues. Like you need to know exactly how to move from slide to slide. So another thing that I think is disappointing is when the presenter seems to be taking in the slide and deciding what to say as if it came as somewhat of a surprise to them. Really, they should segue, and the moment they hit that clicker, you know what that segue was all about, because you moved effortlessly into that slide.
Interesting. And by the way, Victor, that's not a virtual background. That's really where you are, right?
Am I currently in the Amazon?
You are currently in the Amazon.
Yeah.
Karen, you were going to say something.
Wow, yeah, that's a nice background. Now, I was going to say, in terms of presenting data visually, if anyone hasn't looked at the books that Edward Tufte has, Tufte, he's kind of an information guru. He's a bit of a character, but I've gone to his conferences, his seminars. He's really quite good. And I use some of the things I learned from him when I create graphs. one of his major principles is to eliminate what he calls chart junk. So, you know, when you create a figure like in Excel, it defaults to have the grid lines, you know, that correspond with the y-axis labels, and it'll put shading in and this and that. So making sure that the data is really prominent in a figure is important. And then secondly, he also is an advocate of providing well, not in a PowerPoint presentation, but in a figure, in a written figure, to have the information relatively dense. Because you can scan well, like if you think about how you used to scan phone books back when we had the written phone books. So not having a lot of empty space necessarily, but making it efficient for the reader so that they can scan a relatively small area and see and, you know, get the information they need. But at the same time, that's with the data, but not cluttering it with this other chart junk. And then, yeah, related to that, another tip he has is when you have a table, for example, or even a graph, make the borders and the axes a thin and a lighter color font than the actual data. So maybe make your axes lines gray and then the data, the lines black, so that the structure of the table or the figure is kind of in the background, and what's popping out at you is the data.
You know, there used to be specialists when you talk about film and video. There was the lighting person, the sound person, the makeup person, all of those individuals. And I find today, one of the things that's challenging to me is you have to kind of know it all, graphics, fonts, etc. But it's kind of the way it is. Maybe you can have somebody who's a friend or a colleague help you out. There's a lot of collaboration in those areas. I know that some of our fellows are collaborating globally with people in various disciplines, but it's interesting that just the graphics and the slides themselves is an art form, and not everybody does it well. But I do really, it frustrates me when I go to a presentation and somebody says, this first slide, you can't really read this, but this is what it would say if you could. And it just drives me nuts. Karen, do you have any sort of last observation here? We're recording this, as I mentioned, and I'm a little nervous, frankly, because I'm used to doing interviews with one person and I could switch cameras, but I'm putting up the chat screen and the participants. So I hope your face isn't covered by the chat or by the participant number 25 or whatever. But anyway, do you have any kind of last closing observation for the group?
Well, first I want to underscore what the other speakers said about the importance of written communication. I agree that writing and communication in general is probably the most important skill as scientists. So I want to really encourage you all to develop that. And whether you stay in academia or go into industry, you know, it's equally true there. As you know, many of the problems that we have that occur in business are due to communication gaps. So I can't stress that enough, how important it is to do that. And then secondly, I think, as I said, this pandemic gives us all an opportunity to kind of be ambassadors for science and to practice our scientific communication skills. I've been finding, in general, I never talk to like my horse trainer and other people, some of my friends about science, but with the COVID-19, knowing I'm a scientist, they're asking me all these questions. I don't know if other fellows are experiencing that too, but family and friends are now asking me questions, and I'm having to learn how to, you know, answer these and develop these skills of scientific communication. So it's a lifelong process, and I think we can all do some good, you know, and help people with this pandemic.
Karen, thank you so much. This has been fun and interesting. I want to thank the board of directors of the Giannini Foundation, and of course our scientific advisory panel and Gilead Sciences as well. So thank you all very, very much.